Bluejohn Canyon Arm, Amputation Survival. On April 26, 2003, a 27-year-old adventurer named Aaron Ralston hiked alone into a remote slot canyon in Utah. Bluejohn Canyon was a deep, winding crack in the desert, in places barely wider than a man's body. Aaron was an expert climber who had conquered mountains all over America, but that morning, he made one small mistake that would change his life forever. He told no one where he was going. Deep in the canyon, Aaron climbed down over a giant boulder wedged between the walls. The boulder shifted under his weight. It crashed down with him and pinned his right hand against the canyon wall. The rock weighed around 800 pounds. His hand was crushed and his arm was locked in the stone like a bolt. Aaron was trapped, standing up, in a crack in the earth, miles from any road. All he had was 2 small burritos, a little water, some climbing rope, and a cheap multi-tool with a dull blade. He tried everything. He chipped at the boulder for hours, but the blade barely scratched it. He rigged ropes and pulleys to lift the rock, but it did not move an inch. Days passed, and his food ran out, and then his water. Nobody on Earth knew where he was. By the 5th day, Aaron believed he was going to die in that crack. He used his video camera to record goodbye messages to his family. He even carved his own name and the letters EP into the canyon wall. Then that night, something changed inside his mind. He later said he saw a vision of a small boy, a son he did not yet have. He woke up with a plan that most people cannot even imagine. The dull blade could never cut through bone. So Aaron decided he would not cut the bone. He threw his body against the trapped arm and snapped the first bone himself. Then he snapped the second. And then, with the small, dull blade, he began to cut himself free. It took about 1 hour. When it was over, Aaron stepped back from the boulder, free, one arm shorter, and losing blood fast. But the canyon was not finished with him. He still had to lower himself down a 65-foot cliff with one hand. Then he walked nearly 7 miles through the burning desert. A family of hikers found him, and a rescue helicopter carried him away just in time. Aaron had survived 127 hours in the canyon. Today, he still climbs mountains, with a metal axe where his right hand used to be. Boot leather candle wax survival. On March 11, 1998, a caver named Victor entered a limestone cave alone in the mountains of Eastern Europe. He was an experienced explorer, and this cave was one he had visited many times before. He carried a small pack, a lamp, spare candles, matches, a water flask, and 1 sandwich. It was supposed to be a 6-hour trip. 2 hours in, as Victor crawled through a low passage, the mountain made a sound like thunder. Behind him, the passage ceiling collapsed. Tons of broken rock now stood between Victor and the only way out. He dug at the rubble until his fingers bled, but for every stone he moved, 2 more slid down. Victor was sealed inside the mountain. He forced himself to stay calm and take stock of his situation. Water was not a problem. A thin trickle ran down the cave wall, enough to drink. Light was not a problem yet. He had his candles. Food was the problem. 1 sandwich and no way of knowing how long rescue would take. He ate half the sandwich on day 1 and the other half on day 2. By day 4, the hunger had become a living thing gnawing inside him. His body was burning itself for fuel and his strength was fading fast. That is when Victor remembered stories the old miners used to tell. Stories of trapped men who survived by eating the only things a working man carries underground: his boots and his candles. Victor cut a strip of leather from his boot with his pocket knife. He soaked it in the trickle of water until it softened, and then he chewed. He chewed each strip for an hour before he could swallow it. Then he bit a piece of candle wax and swallowed that too. The leather gave him almost nothing, and the wax was not much better. But it kept his stomach working, and it kept his mind from falling apart. Day after day, he cut, soaked, chewed, and waited in the dark. He tapped on the rock with a stone, 3 taps at a time, over and over. On the 9th day, a farmer searching for a lost goat heard the tapping through a crack in the hillside. Rescue teams dug for 14 hours to reach him. When they pulled Victor out, he was barefoot. Both boots were gone, eaten strip by strip, along with every candle he had not burned. Doctors said the leather and wax had given his body almost no real food. But they agreed on one thing: the act of eating and of fighting is what kept the man inside him alive. Guano water sickness survival. On June 19, 2015, a caver named Mateo squeezed into a jungle cave in Central America to photograph its famous bat colony. The cave was home to hundreds of thousands of bats, hanging from the ceiling in a living black carpet. Mateo knew the smell would be terrible, but the photos would be worth it. He climbed down through a steep entrance shaft using an old rope left by earlier explorers. Deep inside, he set up his camera at the edge of a huge chamber. That is when the old rope, rotted by years of damp air, finally gave up. It snapped somewhere above him and slithered down the shaft into a heap. The way he had come down was now a smooth, unclimbable wall. Matteo shouted until his voice cracked, but the jungle above swallowed every sound. His water bottle held enough for one day, maybe two. He knew the brutal math of survival. 3 days without water, and the body starts to shut down. There was water in the cave, but it was the kind of water that made his stomach turn just looking at it. A wide, still pool sat directly under the bat colony. Years of droppings had turned its surface into a film of brown and green scum. The smell rising off it burned his nose from 10 feet away. For 2 days, Matteo drank from his bottle and stared at that pool, praying rescue would come first. It did not. On the 3rd day, with his tongue swelling and his head pounding, he made the choice. He pulled off his shirt and stretched it over his helmet like a filter. He scooped the least filthy water he could find and let it strain through the cloth. Then he closed his eyes, held his breath, and drank. It was the worst thing he had ever tasted. It was also the thing that kept his heart beating. Day after day, he strained and drank, strained and drank. On the 6th day, a search team following his parked car finally found the cave entrance. A rescuer came down on a fresh rope, and Matteo wept as he was lifted into the sunlight. But the cave was not done with him. Within a week, a fever hit him like a truck. The filthy water and the fungus that grows in bat droppings had planted an infection deep in his body. He spent almost a month in a hospital bed, fighting the sickness the pool had given him. Doctors told him the hard truth of his survival. The water that nearly killed him was also the only reason he lived long enough to be rescued. Underground, sometimes the thing that saves you and the thing that hurts you are the same thing. Midnight Cave Voluntary Isolation Experiment. On February 14, 1972, a French scientist climbed down into a cave in Texas and asked the people above to seal him away from time itself. His name was Michel Siffre, and every person in this video was trapped by accident. Michael trapped himself on purpose. 10 years earlier, at just 23 years old, he had spent 2 months alone inside a freezing glacier cave in the Alps. He came out convinced of something incredible. Deep underground, with no sun and no clocks, the human sense of time simply falls apart. Now he wanted to prove it with the biggest experiment of his life. 6 months alone in Midnight Cave, deep beneath the Texas desert. No clock, no calendar, no daylight, and no voice allowed to tell him the date. He had food, water, lights, books, and science equipment, everything except time. Even NASA watched closely, wondering what deep space would do to a lonely human mind. At first, the experiment felt like an adventure. Michel woke, worked, ate, and slept whenever his body told him to. But without the sun, his days quietly began to stretch. Sometimes he stayed awake for 36 hours straight. Anne believed it was a normal day. His mind was losing its grip on time, exactly as he had predicted. What he had not predicted was what the darkness would do to his heart. The loneliness came down on him like a slow landslide. His memory began to fail. Some days he could not remember what he had done the day before. Music lost its meaning, and books became walls of empty words. Then in the darkness, he found a friend. A little mouse had been stealing crumbs from his supplies. Mikkel spent days trying to win its trust. That tiny life became the most important thing in his world. One night, he tried to trap it gently under a dish to keep it close as a pet. The dish came down wrong, and the little mouse was killed. Michael later wrote that this was the moment the silence truly crushed him. He sank into the deepest sadness of his life alone, half a year underground by his own choice. But he refused to press the button that would end the experiment. He held on, day after shapeless day, for science. When his team finally came for him, Michel was certain they had arrived early. They had not. He had been underground for 205 days, and his mind had lost track of months. His suffering built a whole new field of science, the study of the human body clock. His cave data still helps astronauts, submarine crews, and night workers today. Michel Siffre proved the strangest truth on this channel. The deadliest thing underground is not rock, or water, or darkness. It is time itself.